Good afternoon, everybody. I'm so honored to be here with you today for your Lunch and Learn. This is wonderful. My name is Usherla DeBerry. My sign name is a U at the corner of your mouth, the bottom of your chin. I'm one of your co-presenters today. When I make a comment, I will sign my name and then give a count of 3. Let me give a visual description. I have a white background. I have shoulder-length hair. I'm wearing glasses and I have a black shirt with no sleeves. Behind me is a really neat partition with lots of texture on it. And so I'm excited for our Zoom meeting today. I hope you enjoy our presentation. So if you need a clarifying question and you have something to ask or you have something to add, please hold all those questions to the end because we will have a time for a Q&A. So just go ahead and document your questions while we go through our presentation. You can also put the electronic hand up in the chat box or make a comment in the chat box. And at that Q&A time, we will call on you to assign your question or voice your question. We are going to have our videos on just our presenters and our interpreters, and everybody else will remain camera off until the end of the presentation if you want to turn your camera on to speak your question. You might notice an interpreter doing this motion, which is an indicator to us that it's time for us to pause and allow the interpreters a moment to switch, and then we'll proceed with our presentation. We also have CART today, closed captions. The link is available. If you press the closed caption icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you will notice we have CART embedded in Zoom, or you can click the link in the chat box and stream it to another device. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Katie. Katie?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Ashila, for that introduction. And I am going to go ahead and ask our communication facilitator, is Tony Davis today. So, Tony, if you would not mind putting the CART link in the chat box for everyone. I'll reiterate a little bit of what Ashila just mentioned, that we do have communication access real-time translation CART captioning today. And it is a specific type of captioning that is preferred by individuals with hearing loss, as it provides live synchronous captioning that provides equal access for individuals. So you will see here today, either at the bottom of your screen, you will see the word-for-word transcription, or I encourage you to also try using this link where you can open the captions in a separate web browser or even on a separate device if you'd like. Even if you may not need captioning today, I just encourage you to use it. That way you can get an idea of what communication access really is all about. And again, I'm Katie Franklin. I am the Hard of Hearing Service Coordinator at our home office in Raleigh, and we're looking forward to talking to you all today about how to make your virtual meetings accessible for deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blinds. Go ahead to the next slide, please. We're going to start you off today by taking a quick little 4-question pretest poll just to kind of test your knowledge of communication access. So we will close the PowerPoint for just a second, and then I will pull up the poll and give everyone a few minutes to answer those questions for us, and then we'll go over the answers. So at this time, we will close the PowerPoint. And I will pull up the poll. So at this time, everyone should see the poll on their screen with 4 questions and multiple answers. And we can't see who responded with what, so feel free to go ahead and make your selections and don't be worried about if you get anything wrong. Right, looks like everyone may be done taking the poll, so I'm going to go ahead and close that. And share the results with you all. All right, let's go ahead and pull the PowerPoint back up. And you'll see that the interpreters come on from time to time and give the little U shape with their hand, and just to let you know, they are doing an interpreter switch, so we will have those pauses throughout the presentation just to keep you informed of what's going on for communication access today. And we'll go ahead and pull the PowerPoint back up and set up to the poll question slide. We'll review the answers. All right, thank you so much, Tony. All right, so question 1, what does nothing about us without us mean when it comes to working with deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind populations? If you answered D, which is both B and C, you're right. Hope everyone did well. All right, let's move on to question 2. Communication rules such as raising your hand if you want to speak or waiting for the facilitator to recognize you before you talk should be part of every meeting, regardless of whether deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind people participate. If you answered true, you're correct. Question 3. There are over 48 million deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind people in the United States, and over 1.2 million here in North Carolina. If you answered true, you're correct. Also, to give you a little more information, that 1.2 million who are deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind represent those only over the age of 18, so the true number will actually be higher than that. And the last question. What types of communication accommodations should I provide for populations with hearing loss at my virtual meeting or webinar? If you selected E, you're right. Both ASL and CART captioning would be appropriate accommodations. All right, I hope you all enjoyed answering those questions today, and let's go ahead to the next slide and learn a little bit more about communication access. So these are our objectives today, and I'm going to read these over for you. To gain awareness of and recognize the importance of communication equity, to recognize some of the barriers to participation in meetings, events, and trainings, to learn about solutions, to understand to ensure procedures and guidelines translate to effective practices resulting in communication equity, to be able to access key resources designed to foster communication equity in encounters with deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind individuals, to be able to contact and engage the Division of Services for Deaf and Hard of Hearing and other departmental subject matter experts to build capacity to ensure communication equity, and to understand what nothing about us without us means when working and serving deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind employees and consumers. Next slide, please. Here we have some pictures of your favorite actors, musicians, and scholars. And you may not have even known that some of them were deaf or hard of hearing or deaf-blind. This is just to give you an idea of who we are and that you may not always know when someone has hearing loss. Next slide, please. I'll give you all a minute to take a look at this slide. It's important to know that there are several civil rights acts to protect people with disabilities and ensure equal access. These are just a few of the major ones to familiarize yourself with. These laws protect individuals with disabilities by making sure they have the same access to all aspects of life as those without disabilities. This includes individuals with hearing loss and requires entities to provide equal access to communication. Individuals with hearing loss must have access to the same information, programs, services, and goods as those without hearing loss. These laws don't exist to restrict you, but they are to provide communication equity for people with hearing loss. It's important to ask the person who's requesting access what they prefer or need for an accommodation. And it's important to know that it's the responsibility of the service provider to provide and pay for effective communication. Next slide, please. You see here, we're displaying that hearing loss is like an iceberg. You may only see the tip, but the effects are much greater below the surface where you can't see. You see here, there's many aspects of a person's life that can be impacted by hearing loss, and I'll touch and expand on a few of those. Relationships. It's difficult to have good, meaningful, and deep conversations when one person can't understand what the other is saying. Marriages, partnerships, relationships with other families struggle when communication breaks down. You may have loved ones that live far away from you, or you may have even noticed during the pandemic when trying to make phone calls and have FaceTimes with family members that may have hearing loss. It's difficult to have a conversation when one person can't understand. A person with hearing loss may stop calling and contacting their family members because it becomes so difficult for them. Self-esteem. It's difficult to have high self-esteem when we're not confident about our abilities to understand conversations. We begin to question our abilities to provide meaningful input. For example, there may be an individual who loves to go to social events and stand out in the crowd, tell a joke, and make everyone laugh. Now, when they have hearing loss, they may start sitting back more. They may stop being the center of attention, stop telling that joke that makes everyone laugh, because they have less self-esteem and confidence in their abilities to communicate with others, and they don't want to be embarrassed. Socialization. It's common for a person with hearing loss to want to avoid social events, meal times, and other activities because they can't hear what's going on around them, and they're worried about saying embarrassing responses because of not understanding what's being said. I will now turn it over to Ashila to present the next slide.
Please read the information that we have here on the PowerPoint. Some of these myths are pretty common. There are some that may have you thinking, and there's more that we did not list. But it's just talking about what we've noticed that people have mentioned that are more common to the deaf population, those who are deaf, hard of hearing, or deaf-blind. Do deaf people drive? Yeah, we do drive. Does a deaf and deafblind person read Braille? Not every one of them. We make that assumption that they do. You get to a restaurant, you say, I'm deaf. I have 2 interpreters with me, and they will get a seat for the 3 of us. And the host may give me a menu, but it's in Braille. I never said that I couldn't see, but they make that assumption because I am deaf that I must read Braille. And again, that does not apply to every one individuals in the population. You know, I'll make you laugh to include the host. I'll make it a teachable moment at that moment. Deaf, blind, hard of hearing, deaf people. It's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to communication needs. There's a variety of needs that are within these populations. So it is always great to check in with that individual to find out what kind of accommodation is needed. Oh, they lip read very well. But to be honest with you, there's a lot of misconceptions when you're reading. A lot of misunderstanding happening. People who have a mild hearing loss, they may not feel like they need an accommodation. Or you may assume they don't, but you can assume that. You don't know what accommodations that could be offered. And maybe what you offer is better than what you assume. Hearing aids, cochlear implants, amplifies the hearing. You know, when you put on glasses, people think that you can see better. But it doesn't mean it's 100% accurate. And these are just some of the myths. They think that some deaf people can't hear music. You'll be surprised how much they can hear and how many people who have a profound hearing loss, but with some volume, hey, that vibration, they find a way to enjoy music. If the ASL interpreter is not available, it may be okay to write back and forth. And there are some people that do that, and there's some people who might not mind. But again, check in with the individual. Ask them, is it okay if we write back and forth? Maybe they might do something else. They might get another interpreter. Don't assume that what you think is best for them is what's best for them. And you know, you always have deaf family members who have hearing children. 9 times out of 10, they have a hearing child. You'd be surprised about that. The statistics prove that. They assume that deaf people are quiet. We're noisy and loud. We hit on things to get each other's attention. You never know. It just really depends on what's going on and what their culture is, their cultural background. So again, this is just to give you just a little glimpse of some common myths. Next slide, please. Please feel free to read some of these information on the slide. Sometimes people may be speaking while they're reading, but with a deaf and an interpreter being in the audience, you may miss what is being said or spoken. So it's a good idea to go ahead and take advantage and read the information. Take about 5 to 10 seconds, maybe even 20 seconds, depending on how much information is on the screen. So I'm asking you to feel free to read at this moment before I begin talking about this slide. This slide is about deaf culture. We want to let you know that deaf people, it does come with the culture. They value their language, storytelling, their history is within the deaf community. So we do have a culture. The community, they have one of those. They have something where they get together and they share information. And they use the information to support one another. Deaf history, deaf legacies, storytelling, sharing of their experiences. their values, maybe what they value about their language, American Sign Language. They talk about the shape of ASL. Maybe they do A, knocking on the door. They play with it a little bit, play with the language, play on the words. B, you open the door. C, oh, I'm looking. With that D right there, oh, ooh, you're in trouble. Whatever the story I'm trying to display with the alphabet, the manual alphabets. It's important here that we incorporate our facial expression with the letters. And facial expression is very important when it comes to our language, when it comes to American Sign Language. Visual communication. ASL is a visual language. For deafblind individuals, it may be used tactily. For those who have a vision loss. Next slide, please.
I'm going to allow you a moment to read this slide. As I already mentioned, ASL is a very complex language. And as in an organization, I don't know how many interactions you have with people who are hearing loss, but you might have a lot of communication with them and you would get used to seeing them use their visual language in various situations. And so the more you interact with deaf people, the more you'll learn about ASL and how to interact with them and about the beauty of deaf culture. Many deaf people use American Sign Language and many don't. And some deaf people ascribe to deaf culture and others don't. The same is true of any other culture. It all depends on where you were born, who you are interacting with, what your background and education is. And if you see somebody sharing a story in ASL, you might see them doing body shifts or simply shifts with their shoulders. That's all part of the language and a part of the expression and grammar of that language. But again, coming back to accommodating your consumers, always ask what they need. Some of your consumers with hearing loss might be very comfortable using written English and others don't. Again, it depends on where they grew up and their educational background. When talking about deaf-blind people, some people might use tactile American Sign Language. Others might use close vision interpreters or have SSPs, which are support service providers. And those support service providers help give them visual information throughout presentations or other meetings. A deafblind person might use a communication system such as haptics, or they might use pro-tactile American Sign Language. Haptics helps provide visual communication within real time, and it's just a touch signals that are done on a person's body, whether that would be their back, their arm, their leg, but it just gives them information about what is going on. There is also different technologies used for deafblind people with specialized software. And again, using appropriate clothing and background and lighting is very important when working with deafblind people. You need to honor and respect their request. And that is why it's important with pre-training to ask the person, what could I do to accommodate you to make this more accessible for you? Some deafblind people might use hearing aids or they might not. It really depends on the person. Some deafblind people use text on a contrasting background or they might use large print. And so it's always best to ask that deafblind person what their preferred accommodations are. Next slide, please. Again, I'm going to pause to let you have a moment to look at this. This is a great slide because it breaks down some do's and don'ts, things that are advisable to do and other things that we advise you not to do. Again, starting with terminology, let's think about not using the word hearing impaired It is best to describe these communities as deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind, or a person with hearing loss, but do not say hearing impaired. And ask how we prefer our communication. Do not make assumptions. We are not all the same. ASL is not the appropriate accommodation for everybody with hearing loss. So make sure you have an attitude of inclusiveness. Continue to try to build better communication with those who are deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind, whether that be taking more training or asking more questions. But again, just don't assume, and especially don't assume that note-taking is sufficient or just writing notes back and forth is sufficient for every single person. Please always ask a deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind person for their comments or questions or feedback. Never say never mind or just blow them off or exclude them. Continue to provide communication accommodations. Ask them what they want and then provide it so that they feel valued and not overlooked. For that deaf, hard of hearing, or deafblind person, let them decide what is appropriate for them. Do not make the decision for the community. And please be aware of implicit biases. Do not think that all deaf, deafblind, and hard of hearing people are all the same. That is a bias and it is not true. So please work hard to work through your implicit biases and break down those communication barriers. We are all unique individuals with unique needs. All of us are very different. Thank you, and now I'm gonna go to the next slide.
I'll give everyone a second to take a look at this slide. When planning events, what are some ways that we can foster belonging? First, you can do this by changing the way you plan for events. Add communication to your event checklist. And if you don't have an event checklist, create one so important steps such as providing access won't be missed. You want to advertise well in advance that communication access will be available if requested. This will show that you're creating an inclusive environment, make people feel comfortable to make their requests, and give yourself time to fulfill their requests. It's your obligation as the event host to provide accommodations to make the event accessible. So why not prepare yourself properly, right? Add communication access into your event budget. That way, there won't be any last-minute surprises. Next slide, please. I'll give you all a second to take a look at this slide. What does the process for making events accessible look like? First, you'll need to start with using an accessible platform. The platform will include the necessary features to provide effective communication. You'll want to advertise and plan to provide communication access, as we discussed earlier. During the event, you'll establish communication rules, which I will discuss more in depth later. This will ensure effective communication for everyone during the meeting. If your event is an online training, accurate and synchronous captioning and ASL interpreters should be provided on screen and easily visible for all participants. This will lead to communication equity for all participants, and that's the goal. Next slide, please. So I talked about advertising for communication access, but what does that look like? On your advertisement, you want to include a clear statement, such as the one shown here. You want to give the viewers a distinct contact in order to make their accommodation requests. The contact also needs to be accessible. For example, providing a phone number would not be appropriate. Next slide, please. I mentioned earlier using an accessible platform, but what features would that include? This slide shows some of those available features. I'll let you take a look at those. It's critical that licensed ASL interpreters are clear, they're easily visible, they can be pinned, where you can make that the only person that you see on the screen, and they are large enough to be seen by the participant. Captioning must be accurate, embedded into the screen, and cart is preferable, as I mentioned earlier. If screen share is used, only the presenter and interpreters should be on screen. Next slide, please. These are some communication guidelines you can adopt to make your meetings accessible. The first one, raise your hand if you want to talk. Wait for the facilitator to recognize you before you begin talking. State your name and wait about 3 seconds before you speak. That will let all participants, whether they're viewing captioning or whether they're deafblind, know who the speaker is and give everyone time to pin interpreters or the speaker, whichever they would like to do for communication. Everyone in the meeting should feel comfortable expressing and receiving information. There should be no sidebar conversations and limit the use of chat for conversations and other chatter. For example, we asked to only use chat today if you have any communication issues. And that's for people that are using the ASL interpreters or cart captioning for accessibility. It's hard to pay attention to the chat feature as well as watch the cart transcript and the interpreter at the same time. So that information that's coming through chat is no longer accessible. You want to take ownership of your communication needs. If you need something, say something. These rules are designed to ensure all participants have communication access needs addressed. Next slide, please. These are your meeting communication tips, whether in person, virtual, or for all meetings. Go ahead and take a look at these. So for in-person events, everyone should be able to see each other. You can do this by sitting in a circle or a semicircle, so that way everyone is visible. You want to have good lighting where everyone can be seen, mannerisms can be seen, faces can be seen, and you want to minimize background noise. For virtual events, video should be on unless there's a presentation being shown, such as today, or there are over 12 attendees. You want to avoid backlighting because that will create shadows on the speaker's face and it will make it harder to see the communication from the speaker. For all meetings, whether they're in person or virtual, there should have communication rules. You want to give the audience time to read the slide before speaking. You want to plan for additional setup time if you're using accommodations. And you want to ensure that all accommodations are working before you begin. And I'll now turn it back over to Ashla for the next slide.
Next slide, please. All right. Please read the slide before I begin. This slide talks about what is American Sign Language. Why are we even talking about that? We want to emphasize that ASL is different from English. We're talking about two different languages. American Sign Language is not a written form of language, even though you may see some deaf individual write as if we're signing it. And so that's where we might need an interpreter to be present. Not to be signed in English, you know, but some people do sign in English, but not everyone follow the English word order. And so that is their culture. That is something that they deal with. Again, that is their culture. And so that is not English. I want to emphasize that. They have their own grammatical structure. And it has its own syntax. So again, you're talking about two different languages. And again, as I stressed earlier, American Sign Language is a visual language, and that it may be done tactily if it's someone that has a dual sensory loss. And so again, as I said, it's a visual language with its own grammatical rules, every bit as precise, versatile, and subtle as English. Next slide, please. Please read the slide. How can you tell the difference between an ASL and an English interpreter? Remember, interpreters have so many things that are happening, right, as they process the information. And so when Katie was voicing, we had an interpreter here. I happened to be a person in the audience at that time watching the interpreter interpret the information. And when I'm signing, you see the interpreter voicing for me. Interpreters do go from English to ASL. They may have to expound in their language, whether it's going from English to ASL or ASL to English. It is their duty to follow the person message, convey it accurately. They need to include all the meaning. Also the intonation, right? How do they sound? That is all entailed in the interpretation. Next slide, please. Please read this information. If an interpreter is present, you know, they'll always go, that interpreter is so skilled and qualified. You know, it doesn't matter where they stand or they sit, they just know the right place to be. They may even ask the deaf person, where are you comfortable placing me? Do I need to be sitting? Do I need to be standing? When you have an interpreter present, don't look at the interpreter, look directly to the deaf person that's asking the question. As the deaf person, they have to look at the interpreter. That's how they're getting their information. Okay, but that's just out of respect. Look at the deaf person when they're speaking to you. Expound on your explanation. Ask open-ended questions. And it's going to be turn taking. You cannot be speaking on top of the other speaker because the interpreters can't keep up with that information. They're not going to be able to catch everything that is being said. And when that does happen, the interpreter is going to say, oh, excuse me, one at a time, please, and go back to their mode of being the interpreter. We want to feel included as well. We want to know what's going on in the meeting. The interpreter will not interject personal opinions or counsel individuals. Every now and then they may say, do you mind if I ask clarification? It just really just depends, but typically they are not part of the conversation. And the interpreter keeps everything confidential due to their code of conduct. Because of the certification, the license that they hold, they have to maintain confidentiality. And they will interpret everything that is said or signed. Even if you say, don't sign that part, don't say that, they still have to interpret it. Thank you. Next slide, please. Related to PowerPoint presentations or materials that we may use in a meeting, how do you make those things accessible to those that are in your audience? And you need to make it as equally accessible as possible. It's important that everyone has the same information and everybody has access to that information. Pay attention to your text or images that you may have in that material that you're giving out. As I said earlier, you give your name, you say Ursula speaking, 1, 2, 3, and you turn take that way. That is deaf etiquette. And I may add description when you have someone that is visually, that has a vision loss. Giving them information about what I look like, because they have to give that information tactily to the deafblind individual. There are some PowerPoints that will have some type of imagery, and it may have some kind of text description. Once you're done with your slide, make sure that the interpreter has given all that information to the deafblind individual, because they are including all that information that they see on the actual slide. If you put hyperlinks in the chat, they have to let them know hyperlinks are in the chat. When we're using larger fonts, bold print, they're giving that information, any visual information they're providing to the deafblind individual. And so be mindful of that as you're giving that information, that you're also giving that information, the pictures and any kind of description in your verbal responses. If you have any examples, it'd be great to be able to give to the deafblind so they can get a feel of it as well. And every slide needs to have a title so you'll know what that particular slide will entail, what content will be displayed on this particular slide. If you know that it's on Zoom and there may be some issues, then you may want to put a link there in a chat so that people can watch at their own leisure if there's any technical issues going on during the time of your presentation. Next slide. Oh, I meant to go off. Go ahead.
I'll give everyone a
I
second
don't know
to
what's
take
going on my laptop right now. I'm sorry.
I'll give everyone a second to take a look at the pictures on this slide. Here we have some pictures to show examples of different accommodations that can be used for deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind participants. For sake of time, I'm not going to go over all of them with you today, but it's important to remember that one size does not fit all, and even the same person may require different accommodations depending on the environment and other factors. So I'll explain just a couple of the accommodation pictures you see here. You see a picture in the very middle of your screen, which shows a deafblind participant looking at a screen with large font in high contrast. That is showing visual accessibility for that deafblind participant. In the middle row, all the way to the right, you'll see an example of accommodation of communication access real-time translation, CART captioning, which is being used on a tablet. That's the type of captioning that we're using today through Zoom. And then also if you opened it up on a separate device or separate browser, that's giving you a visual of what that would look like. The bottom row, second picture from the right, you'll see a deaf woman in a green shirt using a video phone. That is accessible telecommunications for a person who is deaf. And the picture on the bottom right is an example of an assisting listening device. These can be used in larger in-person meetings where the speaker wears a microphone, and this is transmitted to many receivers and headsets worn by participants with hearing loss. Next slide, please. I'll give you all a few seconds to take a look at this slide. Okay, so what can we do together to help improve inclusivity for deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf-blind participants? We will work with organizations to increase their capacity to effectively serve these populations. For example, giving this presentation today, so you have the information necessary. We will provide specialized knowledge from subject matter experts to help you provide communication access, and you can reach out to us at any time. And how can you help? You can decide that communication equity is critical. Have a seat for us at the table, and we can ensure you're thinking communication access from start to finish in your planning. We can link you with our regional centers for local needs, and we can help you build in communication access within all aspects of your organization. Next slide, please. I'll give you all a second to take a look at this one. I mentioned earlier that we have regional centers, and I want to share with you some information about what they do. You see here is a picture of a map of North Carolina with different sections colored in. That represents the different regions that our 7 regional centers cover. And we do cover all 100 counties in North Carolina. They provide advocacy, consultation, education, information and referral, outreach, and equipment distribution services for consumers. We have a QR code on the next slide, and you can scan that to find more information about the location of our regional centers. Next slide, please. So here on this slide is mine and Ushula's contact information. I'll give you a second to go ahead and jot that down, take a picture of this slide, and we do also have 2 QR codes. The one in the middle is for our website, and the one at the bottom is for our Facebook page. So we encourage you to take a look at those pages as well. I'll give you all a few more seconds to record this information. All right, next slide, please. All right, we are ready for your questions today. And Tony, if you would not mind, go ahead and close the PowerPoint for us. We encourage you to come on screen if you'd like to ask your question verbally, or you can type them into chat and we'll be glad to answer them. And we'll go ahead and pause for interpreter switch. All right, so if anyone would like to come on screen to ask a question today, or if you prefer not to come on screen, you can also type that into chat. And we have Candin coming on screen here. And so Candin, I will call on you to go ahead and ask your question.
Great, thank you. My webcam is not working today, so I apologize for that. But my question is, what is the most common error you see event planners make when considering ADA needs for their events?
Do you want to?
We're negotiating who should take it first. This is Ashrala. Katie, I'll let you start. Go ahead.
All right. This is Katie. So I will not speak from experience on errors that I've seen people make, but some common themes, I think, is just not even thinking communication access from the start. So remember when we were mentioning to include communication access or physical access, whatever type of any access that you need, whether it's in person or virtual, is to be thinking that from start to finish. So when you're making even your first discussions about having an event, be thinking about communication access and incorporating that. So when you announce the event that you're having, you go ahead and, like you saw the flyer that we showed that said, we will have ASL interpreters and communication access real-time translation. If you need other accommodations, please contact us by this date and at this email address, or however you can be contacted. That way you open the door for access. You're providing access that's needed, and you're also making people feel comfortable to request any other accommodations that they need. So it's very important to just plan for that access.
Great, thank you.
Feel free to come on screen and we'll call on you to ask your question, or you can type it in chat and we'll take those in order. And don't be afraid to ask questions today. That's what we're here for. I know we gave you a lot of information, so. You give folks another minute to type a question or come on screen if they'd like to ask. Go ahead, Ashla.
This is Usherla. I just wanted to say, I know we're going to wrap up in just a moment, but this presentation, we are looking to talk about communication equity. And again, I want to emphasize that not one size fits all. Sometimes we as facilitators might think, oh, okay, this means one thing for one person, and so I'm just going to apply that to everybody who I meet who identifies the same way. And that is not true. Some people prefer CART, some people like ASL interpreters, some people like a variety of different accommodations. So please ask the person for their needs and their preferences. It is so easy to assume that all people are the same. Oh, you know sign language, so you must need X, Y, Z. And just because somebody identifies as deaf, it doesn't mean they use American Sign Language. They might have grown up going to a school that didn't use sign language, or they might have been signing from childhood. Everyone is different. There's a lot of variety within the deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind communities. So you really cannot make assumptions. And again, one size does not fit all. 90% of deaf people are born into families where their parents don't know sign language and have typical hearing. And so they might not learn American Sign Language or immerse themselves in deaf culture until later in life. It might not be until they go through college or they go through some type of life-changing event. It just depends on how their family has decided to raise that child. Like I said, some deaf children grow up not using sign language at all. They use speech reading, and others grow up using American Sign Language. So you have to think about what communication equity means to each individual. You know, and that's why we're here today, because we wanted to learn from each other. We wanted to share our experience with you. And we want to just open up this communication world for all of you so that you can provide accommodations which lead to that value of belonging. You know, you want to think about accommodations, and you want to think about how you can make a person feel involved, whether they're using different types of equipment or if they have different needs. And you can always be creative with communication. If you don't have something on hand at the ready, that's okay. Get creative and work with the individuals. And again, we're here to be a resource for you, and anytime you need something, feel free to reach out to us and we can provide consultation.
Thank you, Ashla. So if no one has any other questions, we will wrap up our presentation today. I don't see anything else in chat or any other hands raised. Thank you all so much for having us join your meeting today, and we're so glad that you requested some information on communication access and virtual events. So that's the first step to providing communication equity. Feel free to reach out to us anytime with any additional questions you may think of later, and we'll go ahead and stop the recording. And I will ask Carrie to come on screen so you all can wrap up your meeting and announcements.